Before I stop sharing my screen, I just wanted to go through the agenda very quickly and what we're going to discuss. So we're going to start off with how we can identify our skills gaps, pretty much the most important step because we can't close what we can't identify. How do we shift towards skills-led L&D? How do we bring skills into our performance conversations? The culture that we need for skills to grow, and then lastly, the role of tech in closing skills gaps. So lots to get through. While I stop sharing my screen, Nelson, why don't you kick us off? How can we make this start to identifying the skills gaps? What are some of the actions people can take?
Yeah, I'm glad we're starting with this, Gary, because often people try to bridge skills gaps or say their strategy is about building skills, but actually most organizations we speak to have no idea what skills they have and don't have inside their organization. And so, if you kind of step back to what are we here to do? Well, every organization has a strategy. The question is, do you have the skills to deliver that strategy or not? And the reality is, most organizations can't answer that question. It'd be great to hear in the chat as well, if that's a similar experience you have, or you're enlightened, you are measuring skills, but often that's where that kind of blocker comes in. And so, if you break that problem down, there's really three questions we need to be able to answer to be able to identify those gaps. The first one being, what skills do they need? Right. If you have a strategy, you've got OKRs that tell you whether you're delivering that strategy or not, but you now need to break that strategy down into what skills and skill level do you require to execute that strategy and achieve your OKRs. And so once you know kind of what's required, then you can go into, okay, what do I actually have? Right. I need A, B, and C, but do I actually have A, B, and C in my team or in my organization? And so you can look towards more kind of skills measurement and skills assessment within your organization. And now you've got the two ends, right? You know what's needed, you know what you actually have. Then really the gap should be a lot more apparent to you in terms of what you need to prioritize and close as a skills gap. And then the third part of it is really around, do you have the learning opportunities to be able to align to those skills gaps and therefore be able to connect people with the most relevant learning opportunities and bridge those gaps? Now, I've simplified that massively, but that is the framework in terms of the three questions we need to be able to answer to be able to both kind of identify, but also attempt to fill those skills gaps.
Rebecca, from your perspective, how do you see this first step, identifying the skills gaps?
Yeah, completely agree with Nelson there. I think at Personio, I lead our central L&D team. So we're really looking at those softer skills, power skills, and also leadership development skills across the company. One of the things that's really important to us is that we also use our Personio values called Personio principles for those softer skills and thinking about how those show up in the organization. So I'm sure many of you have different values, operating principles, calling them different things. But we realized about a year ago that we had these and we didn't have clear skills that actually went below them. So we said, like, for instance, one of our Personio principles is deliver exceptional results. But what does that mean in action? And what skills do employees actually need to be able to execute this? So we've actually worked a lot with our execs and different stakeholders across the organization to map out those skills below each of our principles. That was really our starting point. And we're also using a lot of different data points across the company. So we have company-wide pulse surveys. We pull data from performance reviews as well to really identify how are people living these skills, but also where are the key gaps across the organization too.
Nelson, I think what Rebecca said there links nicely to two of the things we discussed when we were collaborating on the guide, but it's around clarity of what skills mean and to Rebecca's point around values, having clarity on what they mean, and also tasks being a good place for finding out what skills you need, right? Typically, a task that has to be completed for a role requires certain skills, and that's a good way to sort of start and work backwards, isn't it? Oh, you're on mute, by the way, Nelson.
So I just didn't want any background noise while Rebecca was talking. But yeah, I think sometimes we overcomplicate things unnecessarily, right? Like I think we know a skill is our ability to do something with an expected result, right? So a good example I always go back to is if I can tell you the steps of how to ride a bike, that means I have the knowledge of how to ride a bike, but it doesn't mean I have the skill to ride a bike. Unless you give me a bike and I can actually get on the bike and ride it. That means I have the skill to be able to ride the bike. And so that's essentially what we're looking at. And skills do also capture things like behaviors, right? Because behaviors are things we do. And so I think it's a great move, what Rebecca said, in terms of a lot of companies don't do that. They have kind of operating principles and values, but there's this massive gap where you're like, okay, I get that's our value, but what do I need to do to demonstrate acting in a way that's aligned to those values? And really kind of breaking that down to the skills that make up that particular value is a key one. And when going back to the point you mentioned, Gary, around connecting job roles and skills, now the important step that often we see organizations miss is it's not the job role that has skill requirements, right? Or the job title. Because if you take a job title like a project manager, for example, that job title hasn't changed in the last 2 to 3 decades. But if you ask a project manager, they'll tell you the tasks that they do on a day-to-day basis has significantly changed. And that's true for a lot of job roles where the title hasn't changed, but actually the task that they do has significantly changed over the years. And that's why what you need to be able to do is take a job title and deconstruct that job role into the tasks that that person has to do. And it's the tasks that dictate the skill and skill level they need to be able to execute that task, right? And that's why building out that kind of task library and then connecting that with what are the skills and level that they need is such an important step. And because it also helps you model the impact of changes in the world. Like, let's just take generative AI, right? And generative AI is going to automate some of those tasks that each of us do. And unless you've broken down the job role into tasks, it's hard for you to know what the impact of generative AI is on the skills that you need to build. But if you've got that task breakdown, now you know, okay, out of these 10 tasks, 4 of these tasks are going to be automated. So it doesn't really make sense for you to develop skills for those 4 tasks that are going to be automated. Instead, you should be allocating your resources and time to prioritize those 6 tasks that you're not going to be able to automate with generative AI, and therefore probably have to upskill or reskill to be able to do those. And that's why it's such an important step in that journey.
Nice. Rebecca, and I'm asking because I'm really curious. I imagine people are as well, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you built that clarity around what values are, given that there was a correlation between the values and the skill, and you needed to define what they meant.
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's more difficult the more people you bring in across the organization, right? I think it would be really easy for us as the HR, the people team to say, okay, this is what's needed. Here's the values. Great, easy, here you go. But I think one of the main things here, and I'm sure those of you who work in learning teams will agree, is that if employees don't see the relevance to them in their daily lives, you can tell them this is a skill you need, and it can kind of fall on the back burner. So really bringing in stakeholders from each department, people partners, as well as our exec team to break down and have difficult conversations around this is a principle. What does this look like in action? We also created a toolkit for each team to have conversations using a Miro board about each principle and saying, what does this look like in action for your team? What are the key skills that you think contribute to this? We actually did this in one of our company-wide events. So we had the opportunity to have every employee together in the same room. We asked them, we had them document this, and then we compiled all of this data, all of these talking points to help us actually determine what these key skills are. And then, of course, we worked with our executive team on really solidifying, simplifying, and targeting those skills as well. But I think as much as you can, getting the employee voices on the table too. As much as I'd love to say our team knows exactly what role each employee is doing and what those tasks are, I think that can be really difficult. So bringing in as many voices as possible. If you do have events or times when all of your employees together, I think that can be a really, really great activity to do and then to play that back as well.
And I know this influenced how you approach the idea of bringing skills into learning because of like I think what people struggle with is there's obviously desire to implement more skills-based learning in companies, but what we see in the data is that very few make it to that stage of impact and measurement, and they really want to get there. So tell us a little bit about how you're approaching this at Personio. You know, you've got these values and kind of skills related to them defined. How are you now moving towards skills first L&D off the back of that?
Definitely. So one of the things I'll say just transparently is I have a very small team and we really needed to prioritize. So the first step was really being transparent and setting clear expectations with employees on what these key skills and behaviors were beneath each of our principles. But then from there, my team needed to prioritize which ones we actually wanted to focus on moving the needle on first. We couldn't do it all at once. So we worked with really pulse survey data, again, employee voices, and identified two key skills that we're actually focusing on this quarter for both leaders and also individual contributors. And that is around how they're delivering feedback and engaging in difficult conversations, and also the skills that are needed to navigate change. I think that those are the two that we identified will really move the needle on business performance, but also those are the skills that employees need to reach the next level of their career. So I think also when we play that back to employees, again, they want to know what's in it for them, right? What the relevance is for them. So being really clear, both in our performance conversations and how we market these skills, that this will help the business, but this will also help you progress. And then from there, we really focused on enablement and different learning opportunities focused on these key skills on our team. So that's everything from more traditional trainings, but also peer learning circles we found have been probably the most impactful and the most attended when we think about different interventions where employees who are already demonstrating these skills are actually able to coach and share what's working for them too.
And I think you mentioned when we spoke before that you were using surveys before and after the activities, right? So it was,
Yes.
yeah, either side of the intervention, you're understanding what influence that's had on someone's skill in that value related area.
Absolutely. And of course, we're using Personio to track attendance in these sessions as well. So we really use again our pulse surveys to actually correlate who's participated in these different learning interventions and how has that influenced potential team pulse scores and also performance reviews.
Cool. Nelson, from your perspective, this shift towards skills first L&D in practice, what are some of the ways we can approach that?
Yeah, it's definitely a shift, right? I think that's the first thing people need to acknowledge. It's probably quite different to what we call the traditional approach to L&D is what we'd call a content first approach, right? Where the key questions we're really asking is, what content does this employee need? How am I going to get this content to them? And that's where kind of training needs analysis comes in. You go in and procure content or you create content and then you push it out and you hope for the best in terms of someone engaging with it and finding it relevant and meaningful. This is quite a departure from that, rather than being quite reactive and doing a training needs analysis, because often by the time you do a training needs analysis, that problem could have existed in the business for a while before you found out that someone's basically had enough time to diagnose themselves, self-prescribe, and come to you and say, can I have this course? Which might not be right? They might not have diagnosed the problem right in the first place. And instead, you're shifting to a more proactive way of diagnosing problems. And that's where kind of continuous skills measurement comes in. And so, a very light touch way of doing that is actually a 360 skills assessment. So you just use a well-known, so for example, organizations we work with use HowNow to use a 5-level scale, which is a well-known scale called the Dreyfus Skill Acquisition Model, which is basically 5 levels starting from novice to expert. And then you combine self-assessment, peer assessment, and manager assessment on that same 5-level scale. Now, the reason why this works really well is because it's evidence-backed, right? Rather than you take an arbitrary test and now me saying you're 4 out of 5, I'm actually basing it on, well, I saw you do this in day-to-day within a work context. And based on what I've seen you apply within a work context, I actually think you're at a 3 based on the skill level description that you have. And so I think that if you're doing that continuously, you're now monitoring, right? And you could be proactive about it when the business says, this is our 2025 strategy. Well, you can look at that skills data and say, well, if this is our OKR for next year, I can tell you right now, we're low on this skill, and we need to prioritize those gaps. So I think that's one of the major shifts that needs to happen. The other one is how we actually think about learning opportunities and content, right? Again, going back to the content first approach was very much around e-learning, classroom training, or doing it on Zoom. The reality is that sage on the stage and e-learning isn't going to be the most effective way of us developing skills, right? That's a hangover from traditional education that's carried itself over, we've all been to, say, school, colleges, some of us universities, and you go, okay, this is how they taught us, so this is how I must teach people in an organization. So there's that kind of hangover. But the reality is, if I asked all of you on this session, think about the last time you learned something that had a big impact on your performance or career. Take a moment. I'll put my house down that none of you are going to say you're LMS, right? And most people will probably say, it was a YouTube video, a podcast, a blog, a webinar, and book, mentoring, coaching. So there's a whole diverse learning ecosystem. And so what you need to be able to do is we help organizations we partner with to essentially bring that learning ecosystem together into a single platform where you've got that single front door to all of your learning that's been mapped to your skills. Right? Because it might be a mentor that's going to help me get from a level 3 to a level 4 in leadership, right? It might be a podcast that's going to contribute towards me getting better at negotiation skills. So I think it's another shift where instead of thinking about content, we think about a learning ecosystem, and our role of L&D changes then. It changes from being a production facility or procurement facility of buying and creating content to really being the curators of this ecosystem and taking the friction out of people being able to find relevant resources from this ecosystem that are aligned to the skills gaps they have. And so I think that's a key difference in the way we think about it now, and a key element of the skills first approach to L&D.
What I love about what both of you said, there's a real common thread of prioritization. Like Rebecca, you mentioned it won't happen overnight. Nelson, you mentioned where's our business going? Where do we need to solve the most common problem or the most significant problem to reaching our goals? And actually, I think this is maybe why people get overwhelmed sometimes, is thinking they need to solve all of the gaps at once. But really, to both your points there, if you start with the ones that are most common or most significant in terms of hitting our goals, then you're kind of setting yourself up for a more manageable entrance into the world of skills first. Cool. I've got some more data here. I lied earlier. It wasn't all going to be fun quiz data, but I read a great stat last year, and it was 64% of people view their performance review process as always or sometimes a waste of time. And off the back of that, only 13% had a clear career growth path offered by their employer. And I actually think bringing skills into performance conversations is a much better way to do this, because it's forward looking as opposed to what happened in the last year versus what skills do you need to then go on and hit that. So I would love to kind of dive into this a little bit. How do we bring skills into the performance conversations and really ensure that people are then going out with a positive mindset about, I'm going to go and fill these skills gaps and stay relevant to our point from the very first data point on the quiz. People don't think their employer invests in skills. So Nelson, tell us a little bit about skills and performance conversations.
Yeah, I think one thing is just kind of separate out performance management from kind of a development conversation, right? Like I think sometimes it's a murky area to kind of tie these two together. But it's really being able to, I think with the development conversation, there's a very kind of clear what's in it for you, for the employee, right? And I think what skills helps you do is bring the context to that conversation, right? It's like, rather than me saying, I think you should just get better at public speaking, right? Arbitrarily, the skills gives the context to say, well, actually, this is why the business needs this skill. And this is why you getting this skill will be good for you. And so actually, the skill is the kind of universal context that makes the learning relevant for the business and relevant for you as an individual. And that's why it kind of takes out any type of bias and creates that alignment between the organization, you as a line manager and L&D function, and also the individual. And often this is what's missing, right? If you go back to that kind of content first approach, it often ignores that context, right? It's like, here's a training program I've just spent 6 months creating, so you will do this. And if you don't do this, I'm going to nudge your manager and bug your manager until you do this. And if all else fails, I'm going to make it mandatory, so you do this. Right. And without the context, it's not clear what's in it for me and what is the expected outcome. Right. How do we know if this learning's working or not? Right. Fundamentally, we only know if the learning is working or not is if you acquire that skill or skill proficiency, and we start to see that in your performance, which then will feed into that performance management conversation. Right. And so I think that's the first thing, is making sure you are drawing a line there between what is a development conversation versus what is a performance management conversation. But this does require a change in perception, not just from the L&D function and managers, but I think we've been conditioned almost as employees of organizations that we only think training or learning is when they've sent us into a classroom, or we've been like spoken at for about an hour or 2 hours. We have this perception that that's learning. And we don't necessarily consider a constructive feedback session with my manager as learning, right? I don't consider a peer-to-peer conversation, like Rebecca mentioned, like a peer circle, as necessarily as learning in the traditional way we've been conditioned. And I think there is a bit of change in perception that we need to help drive within the organization, where learning doesn't just look like this in a classroom. There are so many different ways learning can come into the flow of work. And I think that requires a bit of marketing within the organization for people to really understand that is also learning.
Rebecca, I know you have thoughts on this, but I know you're also doing this at Personio. You're bringing in the skills into the performance conversation. So tell us kind of your thoughts on that, but also how are you approaching that?
Yeah, definitely. So at Personio, we actually use a performance growth template that every manager has to complete, and also every individual needs to use for their own self-reflection. And I think one of the things, if we want to build this into the organization, we need to build it into our processes and the templates that we're using. So we have a couple questions even in this performance review template for both the individual and the leader, going back to our Personio principles, actually looking at these and saying, what's the one principle, and then what are the skills below that that you could develop in or focus on developing in the next quarter to really get to that next level and have that business impact. And then on the flip side, also acknowledging where that individual is strong in these skills. Again, I think sometimes we only focus on where the lack is, but actually focusing on where they're strong and where they can continue to actually influence others in the organization really helps when we talk about that peer-to-peer learning and that modeling of the behaviors too. So I think first tip is just building this in to the templates and the expectations around those performance reviews and those conversations. But then to Nelson's point, it doesn't stop there. So when we look at our performance review cycle, we actually have the last step as development planning. And again, if we don't have that as an expectation and part of the process, we find it gets overlooked. People are on to the next thing. They've checked the box for the performance review, but it's actually an expectation and something that we're tracking, that each individual creates a development plan with their leader on the back of this performance conversation. And actually, part of that is an action plan. So they first, of course, identify the skills, both where they're strong and also where they can develop, and then creating that action plan of what are the actual steps that you can do to develop in this. And to Nelson's point, very rarely are the steps attend to training or do an e-learning. It's we really try to encourage exposure, practice, feedback, and also kind of making mistakes, I think is a big part of the learning journey that sometimes we like to overlook because it's not as comfortable. So we enable the leader through different development opportunities when we help them think about how to create these development plans, but really thinking about where can you give this person exposure, stretch projects, maybe shadowing to help them practice this skill, knowing that there may be mistakes or it won't be perfect. And then what's the feedback loop look like there too? So it's a bit uncomfortable when they're creating this action plan, I think. It's a lot easier to say, I'll attend this training, check, I've got this skill. But really, yeah, trying to frame it more of what experiences and what can you get exposure to develop this skill, and who can you connect with maybe that's already really strong in this skill.
Yeah. Thinking about the manager part, like how much buy-in did you get, or how much friction did you remove for managers by creating those templates? Because one of the stats I read as well last year is that managers wanted help in 5 areas, and one of the highest ones was how can we have better career conversations? And actually, I think removing the friction, creating more templates, like you say, having it as a process where here's how you run the meeting, here's how you set up the action plan. Like I'd love to know a bit more about the buy-in and what that meant in terms of the manager investment.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first thing that we needed to be very careful of is not making this seem like another task for the manager. I think at Personio, we move very quickly. We expect a lot of our leaders and managers, and the last thing they want is another thing that they have to do to add to their list. So, really framing it and how this can help them, I think to your point, Gary, was huge. We always have enablement sessions and kickoffs with managers at the start of the performance growth cycle. So being really clear on this expectation, showing them the templates. And then we also, I think there's that skill that we need to develop in leaders for this as well. So not just saying this is how your employees will develop skills, but actually they needed help and developing their own skills among how to grow and develop employees. So we had workshops and kind of peer conversations with the leaders themselves to frame this as a development opportunity for them, if that makes sense. But I do think having templates, having processes, and of course, saying this is the starting point, there's also flexibility within this for them to do what they think makes the most sense for their employees too. But really having our team positioned as a support for them rather than another task that they needed to do was key.
I was just going to add, one of my favorite management books is called High Output Management by Andy Grove, former CEO of Intel. But it's a very thin book, but very, very good book. And he kind of highlights that as a manager, you need to seek out high leverage activities, right? And, for me as a manager, going in and doing every task for you is not a high leverage activity because it doesn't scale well. However, learning and development is a high leverage activity, right? Because you're essentially enabling people to build that particular skill. And therefore, over time, that is a scalable way of having an outsized impact on your organization. And I'm not too sure often, especially if you're early in your career as a manager, you might have the tendency, based on what your experience as a learner has been, that this is a tick box exercise, and I have to have this conversation, I have to fill in this form. And I think somewhere the meeting of the minds needs to happen where you understand actually this is a high leverage activity. And I think one of the things that are overlooked, again, going back to marketing from a HR and L&D perspective, is often we don't play back the success stories and case study, right? You might have actually a few managers in your organization who are role modeling that behavior really well and actually have seen really good results as a result of it. And so being able to play that back to other managers who might not be able to, who are kind of later in that process of adopting it and engaging with this process, is probably a better way to drive them, rather than saying, I'm going to call you out and name and shame you if you're not doing this. It's probably not going to be as effective. And so I think it's really getting managers to understand it's a high leverage activity. And I do think managers are overlooked from a perspective of how critical they are for the success of learning and development in an organization, especially from even the tools and tech that's developed. It's typically developed for an L&D person being the admin or HR person being the admin. But actually, we need to decentralize that, right? L&D can create the guidelines and guardrails, but if you're dependent on L&D to do everything in your organization, especially when you're a small team, you're not going to be able to move at the speed that you need to as an organization. So really, when you're bringing in learning tech or HR tech and anything else that's going to impact the performance of individuals in your organization, you really need to look at, is this intuitive enough for a manager to use, right? Like, is it going to be dependent on you, and are you going to become a bottleneck? Or is this something a manager can use and it can become a part of their toolkit? I think it's really critical for driving that adoption and engagement.
Yeah, I love. I think that, again, the common thread is a rebrand of performance conversations across what you both said, because managers might see it as here's another task for me to do, and therefore I'm not invested. And then, like you said, if employees see it as like, oh, I'm just going to get mandated something to do, then for them it's kind of a waste of time. So I can understand why the 64% thought it was a waste of it if they're stuck in that loop. There's a couple more questions we're going to go to, and then we'll take some at the end. So if anyone has got questions, feel free to drop those in the Q&A. I think we've covered a little bit of this throughout the conversation, but I wanted to hone in a little bit around culture and environment and how we build the right space for skills to grow and develop. So, Rebecca, why don't you kick us off, and then we'll go to Nelson.
Yeah, definitely. So I think we've talked a lot first around leader buy-in. And I think if we're thinking about creating that culture of skills and development, even above leader buy-in is senior leader and exec buy-in. I think really starting from the top, because what we found where this culture is the most successful in different pockets of our organization is actually where that senior leader is bought in and has really clear expectations for their leadership team on this. So I think starting there and making sure that your senior leaders and your execs actually have buy-in from this might be common sense, but I think sometimes it can be overlooked. So really starting there and then going with our leaders as well, making sure that they have the enablement and also that leaders have the skills to be able to do this with their teams. So again, not just thinking about individual contributor skills, but a lot of what we prioritize for my team is leader skills to help them actually enable their teams to do this. Another thing that's really important is expectations around culture of feedback. As we're thinking of developing skills, we can't grow and develop unless we're getting feedback, both calling out what we're doing well and also where we can improve. So at Personio, that's one of our biggest emphasis here. We actually use our tool for individuals to both request and deliver feedback. And again, have templates in our tool where people can select an individual skill or Personio principle that they'd like to give or request feedback on. We see this happen the most often on the back of our performance growth cycles because we're really encouraging and expecting employees to do that then. But we're trying to embed this along a culture of continuous feedback and continuous growth and development. So I think that's one of the things. And then to Nelson's point, really highlighting those success stories and people who are doing these skills well and recognizing them, I think really motivates others to try to live these skills too. So we recently had a company summer event and had Personio-wide awards. So people were nominated by their peers based on these Personio principles and the skills that they demonstrated. And they were brought up on stage and recognized by our CEO. From there, now we're leveraging these people who won the awards to actually do their own peer learning sessions and share back how these skills show up for them. So I think people really learning from their peers and seeing that behavior modeled is huge, coupled with that continuous feedback. So you're constantly reinforcing what people are doing well, and maybe where they could focus more on these skills too is important.
I love that. The award ones are great. I always love those because they're very on brand and you always get to you see that side of it come across. Nelson, from your perspective, the culture and environment angle, how do we foster that?
Yeah, I echo everything Rebecca said there. And the only one I'd kind of add to this in my book, Learning at Speed, I actually talk about a bunch of different catalysts for accelerating the speed at which an organization can learn. And I think one of the key ones there is it's kind of psychological safety, right? Even going back to what Rebecca mentioned around giving and receiving feedback. A critical piece for you to be able to drive that culture is the psychological safety. So that breaking that down even more is for me to feel psychologically safe to do something, get it wrong, and make that mistake. And then to make that mistake and not feel like there's going to be some serious repercussions and there's a fear of that failure from it. And I feel like I'm in an environment where I'm going to get constructive feedback, which I can then work on and try and iterate and get feedback there. And I think people often overlook the importance of having that as a pillar of your culture for learning to take place. Right, learning often is a process of trial and error, right? And learning is often a process of dealing with change, right? And so there's a lot of unknown and uncertainty, and we're only able to navigate that uncertainty that comes with learning if we feel psychologically safe. And so I'd say that's a key element for us to kind of foster and drive as a part of our culture to have a very progressive learning culture.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I mean, skills you're rarely going to build a skill without application, and application requires failure or setbacks. So I agree. Last question I wanted to ask you, now obviously you've alluded to how Personio and HowNow solve this from a tech perspective, but actually I think one of the biggest challenges is there's a lack of centralization or there's a real manual part to trying to close skills gaps. And I'd love to just hear a little bit about the role tech can play in closing those skills gaps. So Nelson, you go first and then we'll go to Rebecca.
Yeah, I guess we've kind of touched on a few of these things, but if you take even mapping out your organization from skills perspective, right? I'm sure many of you on here have probably gone through the experience of, going to each of your managers, your heads of departments, asking them, what skill should this person have? Every manager thinks that their skills are special and they've got a special name for the skill, although it's the same as every other department. And so even agreeing on a universal taxonomy or skills language is a struggle. And the data shows it takes roughly around 10 to 12 months on average for an organization to come up with a skills taxonomy, which often ends up in a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet lives and dies, right? The skills dies in the spreadsheet. It's not where managers are going back. It's not the most user friendly for them to be able to apply on a day-to-day basis. And so it's time consuming and it's also ineffective. And so that's where, customers we work with, they use HowNow, where we look at labor market data to look at all of the job roles that are out on the market. We break that down into tasks, and then we use AI to infer what skill and level do you need to have to be able to do that task. And we're then able to connect with your HR system and map every single employee to the skills that are required from them based on the job that they need to do. Then we have the built-in skills assessment tool, again, to be able to scale that 360 assessment. But where really AI comes into play is we're able to map all of the learning opportunities that you have to your skills language, right? So whether it's a YouTube video or blog or course that you've created, they're all speaking the same skills language, making it easy for you to discover relevant learning aligned to those gaps. But where tech also helps you decentralize that is, for example, one of our most popular tools is this AI pathway builder. Now, if you imagine in L&D, if you've ever built a pathway before, you know how difficult it is to figure out, okay, what are all of the learning resources and opportunities I have? I now need to figure out what skills would I get from that opportunity. Then I need to be an instructional designer or learning experience designer to structure that into a pathway. Now, it's very time consuming and resource intensive. And if you do get through that, the chances are you're only going to do it at a cohort level, right? You're going to do it for a team, you might do it for a department. But we have an AI pathway builder, which allows you to, as a manager, go in and say, look, I've just had a one-to-one, and it seems like this person needs to develop negotiation skills. They're currently at a 3, they need to get to a 5. You could go and tell the AI pathway builder, it will look at all of the resources and opportunities that you have available, map it to skills, figure out the right ones, and it's got built-in best practices from an instructional design perspective, and it will create a pathway for you in seconds. And so what you've just helped a manager do is where they would have struggled to build a pathway even at a team level, you've now reduced the friction for them to build tailored learning pathways at an individual level. And again, that's where tech can really help you drive that adoption and engagement in decentralized learning and development so everyone owns it within the organization. And then the last one I'll leave you with is kind of impact. Bottom line is someone somewhere in the organization is going to ask you, what value have you added? What impact have you had? And the reality is your CEO doesn't care how many hours people have spent learning. They don't care how many courses people have completed, but they do care whether you've helped develop the skills needed to deliver the strategy. And unless you're tracking and measuring skills continuously, you can't answer that question and demonstrate impact. And so that's where technology can help you with those continuous check-ins at scale to be able to measure those skills and say, actually, I can see from the reviews that people have done post-learning that actually this learning that we spent X amount on has resulted in 70% of people increasing leadership by 2 proficiency levels. And that has resulted in better career conversations, better retention, and now you're able to build that impact narrative. Now, look, some of these things you could do without tech, but you're probably trying to do it without tech already and realizing it's an absolute nightmare and it takes up so much of your time. You're not able to scale that impact. And that's where technology can really help.
Cool. Thanks, Nelson. And Rebecca, from your perspective, how can tech be used, and in particular, how is Personio being used to solve this issue?
Yeah, so I think I don't have much to add based on what Nelson just said. Completely agree with everything. I think a couple things just simply that we're doing on my team is just every time we have a learning intervention opportunity, whether that's a resource, linking to a podcast, a training, a peer coaching circle, is tagging that specific skill or skills that it maps back to. So we should never be providing a resource or a learning intervention. First of all, if we can't tag it to one of those skills, why are we using our time to do this? But also making it sure it's really clear for employees when they are signing up for something that they know what skills this maps back to. They can also search our catalog and our LMS, to Nelson's point, if they have identified with their leader potentially in a development plan that they have a skill they need to develop. They can go into our LMS, select that skill, and see the different resources that we have available there. So exactly like Nelson said, I think one of the things that technology can really support with too is holding people accountable to this, beyond the performance review. So in Personio, we have a goal setting and tracking feature that we use for employees. So actually documenting in our tool where performance management documentation lives and saying, like, this is the skills that I have aligned with my leader that I'll be developing in the half or the quarter or however you set goals, and being really specific there. And then going back and checking that off in the tool too can be really helpful just for that accountability piece because again, people have a lot of different priorities and we move really quickly. So I think that accountability piece is key and technology really helps with that.
Awesome. So you've heard a bit about HowNow and Personio throughout the session today. I'm going to launch a short poll now. And if you want to know a bit more about HowNow, if you want to know a bit more about Personio, or if you'd like to know a bit more about both, you can just click yes on that. And then someone from our teams will be back in touch with you. And we've managed time to an expert level. If I had to give ourselves a skill rating for managing time, it would be 5 because we have got exactly 15 minutes left to get through some questions. A couple of these have already come in, and if anyone wants to add any more, feel free to do that. I'll actually close the chat now so that we can just get it in the Q&A. But the first one, this is when you were talking about the peer learning groups, Rebecca. It's about what sort of size group works best, and are people signing up for it voluntarily, or are they being assigned that because of a skills gap that's been identified?
Yeah, really great question. So I'll go with the first piece first. We usually will open up the circles to 20 spots. Sometimes if we have a full 20 people, we'll actually break out into smaller breakout groups within the Zoom room if we have multiple facilitators who can really be there to support those conversations. I think oftentimes to create that psychological safety, really having smaller groups is key because peer coaching circles are only effective if people feel free to share their problems and concerns and really come up with solutions together. So again, we limit the events to about 20 spots, and then sometimes we'll even break out into smaller groups within that Zoom room. Right now, they're opt-in sign-up events. So I talked about kind of our centralized repository of different resources that we have based on skills. And this is one of the things that we offer for people to actually sign up for. Again, it's most important actually that the leader is aware that these exist because oftentimes, even though they are opt-in, people are typically only signing up if their leader or their people partner is encouraging them to do this, or if this is something that they've identified in a development plan. So yeah, I think keeping the groups as small as possible. Right now, we have them opt in just to get that buy-in with employees as well.
Nelson, interesting that Rebecca mentioned about the limit in the sizing of groups. Any thoughts on that? You know, when it comes to skills, doing it in a group setting, where it becomes too much? Because obviously earlier you mentioned the sage on stage approach, and I think Rebecca's point there around keeping it to sort of small groups is really interesting. So just wondered if you had any takes.
Yeah, I think that keeping it to small groups is a great idea because it also creates that psychological safety there, right? Where people feel a bit more confident within a smaller group rather than a larger group to be a bit more vulnerable, ask those questions that they need to ask. And I think the other great thing about the peer learning circles is often we kind of overlook again the tribal knowledge that's built up inside an organization. And often you only realize that when someone leaves the organization and all of that good stuff they've learned in the company leaves with them. And you essentially have a leaky bucket, right? And in this day and age, no one can afford to relearn the things that they once knew. You know, organizations have got just enough time to learn those new things that they need to be learning. So it's really important to create that collective intelligence and that organizational memory that keeps it there. And this is one way of doing that, right? It's making sure those internal subject matter experts are getting tapped and they're sharing. It's also recognition, right? Who doesn't want to be recognized as an expert amongst their peers, and creating that forum for people to be valued for their expertise and the skills that they have, I think is a great way of doing it. Another way in which we kind of support companies we work with is, right now when you search within your traditional learning management systems, you probably see courses and kind of e-learning and things like that. But the reality is, when I search for how to do a VLOOKUP, I don't want to get a 3-hour Excel course, but I would love to know who the Excel wizard is inside our organization. So what we at HowNow help companies do is essentially HowNow map to all your people by skills, so we know who the experts are. And so the next time you search for VLOOKUP, we won't just show you resources related to Excel. We'll also show you Gary, who's a VLOOKUP wizard in our organization. And you can reach out to Gary and set up a call, set up some mentoring, or just ask that question. So I think it's connecting people. And it goes back to that point around learning ecosystems, right? The learning ecosystem also includes the internal subject matter experts.
Perfect. Thank you. Rebecca, this came in when you were talking about your performance and development review process and template. So the question is, how many questions does your performance and development review contain? Our managers complain that it takes too long or too much time to do this process. Hence why I'm curious to hear how you balance that qualitative questions and the amount of time required.
Yeah, another great question. So I think we have about 6 questions in our performance review template for managers to answer. And I think to be clear, it does take time. And I think part of it is setting the expectations with leaders that this is part of your role and this is worth the time investment that we're asking you to take. I think performance reviews are only helpful for the employee if the leader has put thought and time into it. So I think part of it, yes, is trying to keep the questions targeted and as simple as possible, but also really setting that expectation with leaders that this is part of your job. If you are not doing this, you're not meeting the expectations of your role, and also really showcasing the benefit of investing the time in this. I think another question maybe I'd ask here is how often are you doing this? So at Personio, we've experimented a little bit with this. We have a really formal, longer performance growth cycle in January. And then we have lighter touch checkpoints throughout the year to get leaders to have these conversations where we're not asking them to fill out this 6-question template, but maybe just answer a couple questions and have that conversation with the employee too. So I think part of it is, yes, how long are they investing, but also how often are you doing this process? I hope that's helpful. I don't have a magic bullet for decreasing time because I think part of it is that this does need to take time to be successful.
Yeah. I guess it's that rebrand point we made earlier, like you have to pitch it as a long run time saver or performance enhancer as opposed to please just do this other thing right now, I guess. A great question here. At my organization, the mindset is very much that classroom style learning is of the most benefit, and employees seem unwilling to take the time to pursue self-directed learning. How can we address this? Any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, you're not alone in thinking this and this perception. And actually, it turns out this is the perception of a very few who sit at the top, who've been conditioned to think that it's going into a classroom and sage and steak. And I think just to kind of give context and where this hangover comes from, going back to traditional education, the big difference between traditional education and workplace learning is often you learn things at school, college, and university that you don't immediately apply. I don't know how many of you on this webinar apply algebra in your day-to-day work or have ever used algebra in your life. And that's often true for a lot of education that we do in schools. Whereas workplace learning is significantly different, right? We are learning things that really we should be able to transfer to the context within which we work every day. And so that transfer and feedback loop of being able to apply what I learn, see if it works, get the feedback, and continuously iterate should be there and should be built into that learning experience. And so it's recognizing first, workplace learning is very different to traditional education. So using those modes is probably not going to work. And so I think there's a bit of change of perception there, right? And nothing does this better than data, right? So the person in your organization who says, I think classroom training works better, what's the data? Let's look at the data. Let's compare a few different data sets. What will you typically, when you dig into this and you do the 5 whys exercise, okay, why do you think it's better? Why do you think it's better? What you tend to find out is they are committing time when it's classroom training. So actually, what often they're trying to say is, if it wasn't classroom training, I would struggle to block out the time to do it. But when you've booked in classroom training and saying, I have to be somewhere for these 2 hours, I'm blocking that time. You have my undivided attention is often what they're really trying to tell you when they say like classroom training. So then what you could do is essentially block that time, right? And use that session to, a concept called fully active learning, where rather than using it for sage on the stage and me lecturing you for 2 hours, instead, I can give you the material beforehand. And then in the session, we can say, look, what we're going to do is work on some live problems where you're going to apply some of the stuff that we've learned and we're going to give each other feedback. So it's actually about using that opportunity where we're interacting synchronously. The other one about time. Now, if you looked at the LinkedIn survey for, I think, the last 3 to 4 years, often this comes up where employees say the biggest barrier for them is a lack of time. Now, again, if you dig into this and ask why, what you find out is actually most of us are learning, right? If you speak to employees, they are listening to podcasts, they're reading blogs, they're going on LinkedIn, they're part of different groups, they're a different part of social groups and peer groups, they're being mentored. What they're saying in that is they don't have time to engage with irrelevant learning that you, the business, thinks that it's important for me. That's what they're saying. I'm too busy to be engaging with stuff that you think is relevant, but I'm telling you is not. And so that shows you almost, A, you might be pushing a lot of irrelevant learning, or it might be a marketing problem where you've not done enough of a job at communicating what is the value, what's in it for me, right? Why is my life going to be better as a result of engaging with this learning? And so it might actually be a marketing problem. Often we jump to the conclusion it's content. You know what? We need to add a few more animations and a few more clicks and make it interactive. But no, it isn't. When was the last time you watched a YouTube video and thought to yourself, I wish this video had more clicks? Never, right? Then why would you think a grown adult at work wants to have loads of e-learning with animations and clicks? Never. And so I think it's really going back to the root cause of the problem.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't think of the last time I wanted a clickable turn over the cards thing whilst I was watching something. Rebecca, from your perspective, this
Yeah,
idea of shifting the mindset.
definitely. I think one way to maybe start addressing this problem is when, to Nelson's point, when you have this classroom-based training, thinking how you can make it more experiential, thinking how you can get people together to solve problems, to build skills rather than, go through a presentation and lecture. The second thing that we do anytime we have a live experience or maybe more of a classroom-based training is also develop an ecosystem of tools around it that are ongoing that people can take back to their jobs. So really showcasing these self-paced resources and tools that apply to this. So whether that's even a checklist, a template, a short video, some challenges they can take back and discussion points they can bring to their team. So not just thinking of this classroom-based training in isolation, but building that ecosystem of on-demand, on-the-job resources that people can take back and use and start to see the value in that as well.
I think it's nice you mentioned ecosystem again there, because actually to the point of self-directed learning, I think that's what's missing for a lot of people now. Lack of clarity on the skill I need to build, lack of ecosystem where I can search for stuff independently. So very nice note to end on. Yeah, no more questions in the chat. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I really found that interesting. I hope you did as well. Thank you, Nelson and Rebecca, for your time. And like I said, if anyone has any questions after this, you can feel free to reach out to us. If you didn't answer in the poll, you can just drop us a message on LinkedIn.